The chamber went silent as Karoline Leavitt tried to defend Trump and Melania, until Jasmine Crockett dropped a revelation so raw, so undeniable, it stripped the defense from her lips. Was this courage, or a political earthquake no one saw coming? The answer ignited a firestorm that America is still reeling from. Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The Manhattan studio felt less like a television set and more like a stage prepared for a national reckoning. Bright lights poured down on the glass desk, catching reflections that shimmered against the polished floor. Above it all, the red tally light glowed, its small steady burn signaling that every second was being transmitted live to millions of homes across the country. The audience in shadow leaned forward, hushed, the energy of expectation hanging thick in the air. Barry Klein, the veteran primetime host, framed the night's theme with professional ease: campaign finance, ethics, and the fragile trust between politicians and the people they claim to serve. At one end of the desk sat Jasmine Crockett, her cobalt blazer sharp under the overhead glare. Across from her, Karoline Leavitt, dressed in ivory, exuded confidence. At least at first. The set was arranged like a courtroom, with the studio cameras serving as silent jurors. This was more than another political debate. It was the kind of moment where reputations could shift, where words could wound deeper than any headline. When Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her voice cut clean through the studio air. If we're discussing money and politics, we can't ignore the 2022 Mar-a-Lago fundraiser hosted by Melania. Timelines, donor structures, and public resources that don't add up. The words landed with the precision of a blade. For half a second, nothing moved. Karoline blinked, her pen stilled mid-air. Her lips parted as if a retort had been ready but evaporated in the shock of hearing Melania's name tied directly to questionable finances. Silence expanded like a wave, rolling outward from the desk to the control booth where producers exchanged sharp glances. Even the floor crew, normally invisible in the rhythm of live broadcast, froze where they stood. Barry Klein attempted to pivot, his polished voice offering a path back to safer ground, but Jasmine was unshaken. She held her gaze steady and clarified, calm and precise. Not personal. Not gossip. Documentation and public filings. Dates, event rosters, and compliance questions. Each word felt deliberate, almost judicial. Her hand rested on a thin slate folder placed neatly before her, a silent promise of evidence. Karoline's pen hovered uselessly above her notes. The audience's collective breath seemed to catch, pulled taut in the charged stillness. And then the screen cut sharp to black, bold words flashing across. Did she attack, or expose, a standard the powerful never answer to? Jasmine Crockett's journey to that Manhattan studio began long before the cameras. Her path ran through Dallas, where she cut her teeth as a public defender in cramped courtrooms, defending people who rarely had anyone else standing beside them. From those early days, she built an ethos she carried into Congress, receipts over rhetoric. She learned that files mattered more than flair, that justice often lived in paperwork overlooked by those with louder voices. FOIA requests, quiet interviews, and cross-referenced filings became her weapons of choice, precision tools in a world that often thrived on noise. Her worldview hardened in those years. To Jasmine, power earned scrutiny. It was not a shield. She had watched silence protect systems that chewed through ordinary families while serving the wealthy with velvet gloves. Tone traps, staged outrage, and weaponized decorum never fooled her. She had seen how calls for civility often masked an attempt to muffle the truth. What mattered was daylight, exposing what powerful institutions preferred to keep buried. The lessons came painfully. She remembered ICE raids where families were split in the dead of night, paperwork twisted into weapons against people who barely had time to breathe. She remembered wealthy applicants sliding through processes that left others stalled for years in bureaucratic limbo. Those experiences taught her to hold pain without spectacle, but to speak with certainty when the record was ready. That balance, silence until the evidence was solid, then precision when it was time, shaped her every move. Days before the primetime debate, a courier slipped a packet into her office. It wasn't some anonymous bombshell, but public-facing documents, open-source materials tied to a high-profile gala. Timelines, donor lists, and event expenditures threaded together in ways that didn't make sense. There were no allegations of crimes, but inconsistencies glared back at her. Numbers that didn't align, resources that raised compliance questions, and the unmistakable shadow of power assuming it would never be asked to explain itself. She spent hours cross-checking against open filings, the methodical rhythm that had always anchored her work. Rena Barrow, her longtime confidant and chief of staff, saw the storm building. Rena's warnings were sharp. The blowback would be vicious, the accusations of overreach relentless. Jasmine listened, weighing caution against conviction, before answering with her familiar calm. Storms pass. Records remain. For her, the choice was simple. She wouldn't wave papers in the air like a stunt. She would frame the issue and let the facts demand their own daylight. It was that discipline, the decision to carry the folder quietly, not as a prop but as a promise, that made her presence at the debate more than performance. She was prepared not to sensationalize, but to insist on accountability. And when the moment came, she would step past the stage-man-managed civility and force the nation to see what it preferred to ignore. Across the aisle of power, a different philosophy held sway. Donald Trump, in this story's context, treated family as armor. For him, any scrutiny of systems tethered to Melania or Barron became an attack on the family itself. By recasting policy and ethics questions as personal affronts, he built a shield that was as emotional as it was political. It was an old move. Turn oversight into insult, transform accountability into slander. But it had worked often enough to feel Melania, positioned in the public eye with carefully polished philanthropic branding, became central to that defense. Events with her name attached weren't just social occasions, they became untouchable ground. Any scrutiny of the timelines or donor structures orbiting her instantly shifted into the realm of unfair attacks on the First Lady. The press played into this dynamic, painting her as apolitical even when the money and influence around her events pulsed with unmistakable political power. Inside the circle, operatives refined this approach into an art. Press Secretary Colby Dent specialized in reframing, quick to declare that any mention of Melania equaled a smear against family dignity. Vice President Raymond Holt, always stone-faced, embodied the optics of disapproval, his silence used as a kind of moral weight. House allies like Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs worked the floor aggressively, their drumbeat for censure timed to drown out debate with chants of loyalty. The machinery was disciplined, predictable, and prepared to pounce. Beyond that machinery stretched the media ecosystem. Conservative radio voices primed their audiences to cry smear the moment Melania's name surfaced in connection with ethics or money. Centrist anchors framed it as a question of tone, rehearsing the language of decorum and respect. Progressive explainers tried to redirect attention back to rules, compliance, and transparency, but their voices often felt smaller against the roar of accusation. The stage was set for outrage no matter the facts. And yet outside the Capitol bubble, the American public was not so easily sorted into camps. Students carrying debt, teachers balancing impossible budgets, veterans who had seen power fail them, and immigrant families who knew what it meant to live under scrutiny, all of them watched debates like this with a personal stake. They knew what it meant to keep documents tucked away as protection, to carry papers like armor. For them, the question wasn't whether Jasmine had crossed a line by naming Melania. It was whether she had finally traced a line everyone could see but few dared to articulate. It was this divide, the machinery of political defense versus the lived experience of ordinary people, that made Jasmine's decision so combustible. In that moment, her insistence on receipts over rhetoric didn't just challenge Karoline Leavitt. It threatened an entire ecosystem built to treat power as untouchable. The studio lights burned hot, but the atmosphere was polished and steady as the live segment opened. The moderator offered the usual introductions, voices measured, posture formal, the rhythm designed to reassure viewers that what they were about to see would be orderly debate. Karoline Leavitt leaned forward, confident, prepared with the talking points she had rehearsed for days. She opened with attacks on reckless democratic spending of the people's money, her delivery crisp, her phrasing calibrated to sound both fiery and disciplined. She spoke quickly, layering phrases about debt, hypocrisy, and out-of-touch elites, It was the cadence she had honed. Attack, pivot, repeat. Jasmine Crockett sat quietly across from her, her expression steady, her body still. She did not flinch, did not frown, did not even interrupt. Instead, she watched with the patience of someone who had heard the script too many times to be surprised. Where others might have shifted in their seat or signaled disapproval, Jasmine let silence become its own answer. And in that silence, viewers noticed the difference between recitation and resolve. When the moderator turned to Jasmine, the expectation was simple. Respond to the economic critique. Spar with familiar lines about jobs and taxes. Instead, Jasmine tilted her head, folded her hands, and offered a pivot that cut through the set stage civility. "Let's define reckless," she said, her voice even but firm. "Reckless is opaque donor routing around a 2022 Mar-a-Lago fundraiser hosted by Melania Trump. Reckless is timelines and structures that don't align, that demand clarity." The studio air shifted in an instant. A producer's pen clattered to the desk off camera. The moderator blinked, stammering to regain footing. The cameras closed in on Jasmine's face as if magnetized by the gravity of the words. "Congresswoman," the moderator said, faltering, "let's stick to policy here." Jasmine leaned slightly forward, her tone calm, measured but cutting. "This is policy," she said. "Public trust is policy. When fundraising becomes a shadow game, when documents don't match timelines, that isn't gossip, it's governance." Karoline's confidence faltered. She tried to summon a prepared line, to spin the conversation back to inflation or national debt. Her lips parted, but the words lagged. The polished veneer cracked as silence filled the air. For 10 seconds, long seconds in broadcast time, the screen held the image of a political surrogate grasping for her line and finding none. It was stillness so raw it became explosive. The moderator, realizing the danger, scrambled to cut to commercial. His voice strained, forcing cheer into his words as he promised they would return in just a moment. But the cameras had already captured the exchange, the stumble, the silence. Those 10 seconds became the match that lit the fuse, an on-air moment destined to be replayed long after the studio lights dimmed. That night, in the private dining room of Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump watched the clip. The table was half cleared, a steak bone pushed to the edge of his plate. The moment Jasmine spoke Melania's name, his eyes narrowed. When Karoline froze, his jaw tightened. And when the moderator cut to break, Trump's fork hit porcelain with a sharp metallic crack. "Make it about attacking a child," he barked. "Every network, every platform." Colby Dent, the press secretary, already had his phone in hand. Within an hour, inboxes across the conservative ecosystem buzzed with uniform talking points. A vicious attack on the first family. A baseless smear against Melania. Reckless politics targeting even a child. The machinery moved like clockwork, flipping the narrative from questions about money to outrage over family. Across town, Jasmine and Rena Barrow sat in a small diner, the kind with worn booths and coffee served in chipped mugs. Rena was blunt. "You're going to get threats," she said, her voice low. "This isn't just politics. They'll come after you personally." Jasmine stirred her tea, calm, unshaken. "If documentation can't be mentioned out loud," she replied, "we don't have a democracy. We have a PR firm." Rena sighed, knowing the storm was inevitable, but also knowing Jasmine would not bend. By midnight, the clip was everywhere. Online editors had spliced split-screen videos showing Jasmine's calm face beside Karoline's frozen silence. Captions screamed, "Leavitt left speechless." Progressive creators added layers of campaign finance rules over the footage, turning her pivot into an explainer. The hashtag #Pigotier. In Karoline's war room, staffers huddled around laptops, each one tense. The question loomed: deny, deflect, or wait it out? Some urged her to issue a fiery rebuttal, to frame herself as victim. Others argued silence might let the moment fade. Karoline herself said nothing, her eyes locked on the replay, watching again and again the instant her words failed. She heard the silence louder each time, her own voice missing, her authority evaporating in real time. The weight of it pressed on her chest. For the first time in her young career, she understood the peril of stillness on live TV. Not power, not control, but the terrifying absence of both. By morning, the counteroffensive began. At a podium framed by American flags, Donald Trump thundered. He called Jasmine Crockett deranged, dangerous, a disgrace to Congress. He leaned hard into the script Dent had polished overnight, declaring that she had dragged Melania and Barron into politics with vicious lies. His voice rose, his fist pounded. Beside him, Vice President Raymond Holt stood rigid, his silence weaponized as solid. Dent, stepping to the microphone, pushed the protect the family narrative with precision, framing Jasmine's words as an un-American violation of decency. Meanwhile, Jasmine sat down for an early CNN interview. The anchors pressed gently, asking if she regretted mentioning Melania by name. Jasmine's cadence was calm, deliberate. This is not about personality. It's not about family. It is systemic. It's about facts on paper, inconsistencies in public records, and the responsibility of oversight. That's all. Her refusal to match Trump's heat with anger caught attention. Even skeptical anchors noted her restraint. She projected not fury but discipline, the posture of someone leaning on evidence rather than outrage. Still, the right-wing media machine roared. Conservative radio hosts labeled her an attack dog, a smear merchant, even un-American. The drumbeat for punishment built through the day. On Capitol Hill, House allies Earl Maddox and Shelton Briggs seized the moment, drafting language for a censure resolution. In back rooms, Speaker staff quietly tallied votes, weighing whether the symbolic rebuke could pass. Centrist Democrats grew nervous, whispering about optics, fretting that their party's fight for transparency might look like personal attack. Among staffers in the halls of Congress, the mood was more conflicted. Whispered conversations turned toward donor vetting, compliance structures, and the kind of filings they had long ignored. Some aides admitted they had seen red flags in other fundraising events but never pushed them forward. Jasmine's confrontation had cracked open not just a political battle but an institutional reckoning. Was the job of Congress to police itself or to protect its own? The question hung in the air, unresolved, as both sides prepared for escalation. And as the morning ended, the footage kept rolling online. 10 seconds of silence, endlessly looped, endlessly debated. Karoline Leavitt's career now teetered on that moment, while Jasmine Crockett's calm insistence that public trust is policy turned into a rallying cry. The confrontation had begun, not a single exchange, but a battle of narratives that would reverberate through Washington, through media, and through the lives of ordinary citizens watching closely to see whose truth would endure. The silence that hung in that Manhattan studio didn't stay contained within the glass walls of the network set. Within minutes, it detonated across the feeds, sparking a war of hashtags, loops, and instant reframings that no one could control. On one side, the Trump orbit and its defenders rallied behind Stop the Smear, framing Jasmine Crockett's calm reference to a Mar-a-Lago fundraiser as a vicious personal attack on Melania Trump. On the other side, progressive watchdogs and transparency advocates amplified post-gala questions, arguing that asking about event structures wasn't gossip but civic duty. Somewhere in between, a neutral tag began to gain momentum, show the filings. It was less partisan, less heated, but carried a simple power. It asked for daylight, not drama. News networks latched onto the moment instantly. Producers in glass-walled control rooms replayed the clip, zooming in on Karoline Leavitt's motionless face as Jasmine's words settled. The chyrons wrote themselves. Privacy or public interest. Ethics versus decorum. Did Crockett cross a line or draw one? Every angle was tested, every pause dissected. What mattered most wasn't just what Jasmine had said, but what Karoline had not. That frozen silence became the loop, the meme, the cultural shorthand for being unprepared when reality intrudes. By nightfall, late-night comedians were scripting their openings around the showdown. One monologue leaned into the absurdity. Sunday night contract law, coming soon to Fox. Tune in for bundling, timelines, and compliance disclosures. The laughter landed, but then the pivot turned serious. The same host who mocked the jargon pressed forward, asking, when public figures leverage their branding for fundraising, what counts as private and what becomes the public's business? The room hushed because the line wasn't easy to draw. It wasn't about comedy anymore. It was about consent, disclosure, and the boundaries of public trust. Podcasts followed suit, dropping emergency episodes that Monday morning. TikTok attorneys with ring lights and microphones explained the basics: how campaign finance laws distinguish between personal donations and bundled contributions, what independent expenditures mean, how gala tickets can blur the lines between philanthropy and political capital. They explained shell LLCs and donor structures in 30-second bursts, but always anchored their breakdowns in Jasmine's steady voice and that now sonic clip. She hadn't raised her tone or pointed a finger. She had simply asked a question that the law itself demanded someone should. In classrooms across the country, civics teachers pivoted their lesson plans overnight. One assigned a trust chain exercise. List what information you think should be public when fundraising intersects with official roles, then trace who checks those disclosures. Students debated in cafeterias whether the First Lady's hosting of a political gala crossed into scrutiny territory. Some argued privacy was paramount. Others countered that public influence couldn't hide behind family branding. Either way, they were learning, arguing with new words, citing real documents, and grasping what transparency meant in practice. The detonation wasn't just media static. It was pedagogy, comedy, outrage, and curiosity braided together. The silence that Karoline had given the camera became the nation's megaphone, and the question Jasmine asked, low, precise, almost surgical, was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every American who wanted to know whether rules were evenly applied or whether power simply rewrote them on demand. What began as a viral clip on cable news quickly bled into every corner of daily life. In diners, PTA meetings, barbershops, and pastors' breakfasts, people who rarely agreed on politics found themselves caught in the same argument. Was this an attack on family or a defense of public trust? Some saw Jasmine's intervention as a violation of an unspoken rule, that families, especially first ladies, were to be shielded. Others argued that shielding was the problem, that power had long hidden behind decorum while avoiding the same scrutiny applied to ordinary citizens. Flash polls taken that week revealed the fractured lines with startling clarity. Independents tilted toward Jasmine's side, often using words like uncomfortable but necessary. For them, it wasn't about liking her politics. It was about respecting that questions should be asked even when the answers make people squirm. Republican base voters, by contrast, hardened their positions. Talk radio hosts reinforced the idea of a smear campaign, a manufactured witch hunt designed to weaken Trump through Melania. Moderates, however, wavered. They spoke about tone, about whether Jasmine could have raised the issue differently. For them, the balance between truth and civility became the central question. Jasmine's office felt the collision firsthand. The inbox flooded with thousands of messages, some laced with fury and threats, others brimming with gratitude. One handwritten letter stood out. A mother in Arizona whose husband had been deported after a decade of working legally wrote, "We carry papers like armor, terrified of forgetting them at home. Thank you for asking who else should carry papers and who never does. Don't let them silence you." Another email, written in shaky prose, warned her that she had awakened forces she could not control. For Jasmine, the juxtaposition crystallized the stakes. Accountability always comes with risk. Generational divides became visible too. Younger voters, fluent in viral clips and explainers, framed the moment in terms of systems and transparency. For them, Crockett had exposed a broader question of accountability, one they wanted applied across the board. Older voters leaned more heavily on rules of politics, seeing her words through the lens of propriety and tradition. Yet both groups agreed on one thing: the clip itself was unforgettable. The stillness, the silence, the way it cut across the noise, no one could shake it. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt retreated into her own silence. She skipped one friendly podcast that week, citing scheduling conflicts. She canceled a minor fundraiser in upstate New York, an event that had been designed to showcase her rising star status. Her staff drafted 3 separate statements, one combative, one conciliatory, one neutral. She signed off on none. Instead, she replayed the clip alone, watching her own blink, her own stalled pause, over and over. In the silence she had offered the world, she found herself trapped. For her, it wasn't about the documents or the fundraiser. It was about being caught unprepared in a world where hesitation goes viral faster than any rebuttal. The public wasn't merely split, it was alive, awake, and waiting. And in politics, waiting audiences are the most dangerous of all. Inside Washington, the shockwaves took on a more formal rhythm. Representative Earl Maddox, a stalwart Trump ally, wasted no time filing a resolution to censure Jasmine Crockett. Within days, co-signers stacked up, and cable producers counted down to the looming floor vote as if it were election night. The spectacle was irresistible. The clash of rules, reputations, and optics condensed into a roll call. The Chiron clocks ticked, and the cameras prepared to make the House chamber the next viral theater. But the leaks proved even more destabilizing than the theatrics. An internal staff note, circulated inside the West Wing, urged surrogates to avoid ad-libbing on marriage or family, reframe as systemic attack on privacy. A second memo contradicted the first. Leaked to the press, it revealed that Melania herself preferred no further mention of the gala at all. Headlines erupted. She wants out. He doubles down. Suddenly, the story wasn't about Jasmine Crockett's words alone. It was about fissures inside the Trump camp, about whether the instinct to escalate clashed with the instinct to retreat. The ripples spread beyond Capitol Hill and the White House. In Albuquerque, Miami, Wichita, and Bakersfield, small marches broke out, not organized by national groups but by local communities. The signs they carried were stark. We're not invisible. Public money, public answers. Same rules for all. These weren't massive protests, but they carried moral weight. They showed that ordinary citizens weren't watching this purely as a Beltway drama. They were inserting themselves into the conversation, insisting that the clip wasn't entertainment but evidence of something larger. Within the halls of Congress, ethics and oversight committees began to stir. Quietly, they sent requests for donor reconciliations and event documentation tied to the Mar-a-Lago fundraiser. White House counsel insisted there had been no wrongdoing, but conceded that in the interest of transparency, certain filings may be appropriate. That language, so cautious, so deliberate, was its own admission that silence couldn't last forever. Every line of inquiry, no matter how modest, turned the stillness of that clip into a living investigation. Then came Karoline Leavitt's moment at the podium. After days of retreat, she finally addressed the press. Her words were halting but clear. I defended something I didn't fully understand. We all owe voters clarity. It wasn't a surrender, but it wasn't the defiance her base expected either. It was an inflection point, a young politician realizing that silence could break a career as much as words could. She had been the face of stillness, and now she was the voice of recalibration. The question was whether anyone in her party would follow. The ripples weren't stopping. They were accelerating, each silence turning into sound, each pause becoming a headline. What began as a 10-second clip in a Manhattan studio had become a test of what America wanted from its leaders: performance or proof. The spark that began in a studio segment did not stay contained to politics. Within days, the cultural current shifted. Across campuses, students began holding sit-ins, but these weren't the loud, slogan-heavy gatherings typical of protest culture. Instead, they sat silently with placards that bore questions rather than answers. Who gets to buy influence? One sign read. Another, what counts as private if it's branded public? Professors noted how rare it was to see inquiry replace declaration, but the effect was undeniable. Young people wanted to debate the boundary between personal image and civic responsibility. Veterans added their voices in town halls. One retired sergeant stood in a VFW hall in Dayton, uniform cap in hand, and declared, "I fought for transparent governance, not curated secrecy. If I filled out disclosure forms for 30 years, why shouldn't anyone tied to office holders face the same?" His words, clipped and gravelly, traveled quickly through online clips. Teachers picked up the refrain in classrooms. Social studies lesson plans incorporated the viral exchange, with assignments asking students to draft their own public interest checklists. The exercise was no longer hypothetical civics. It was tied to a moment every student could watch and analyze. Immigrant families began weaving the moment into their own narratives. Threads appeared across social platforms where parents and children posted snapshots of the documents they were required to carry. green cards, work permits, visas. They captioned them with a recurring phrase, "We carry papers like armor." That line, once spoken quietly by Jasmine in private, became a public refrain. Families explained how their lives were scrutinized in ways that wealth or political status seemed to shield others from. The connection between their personal paperwork and the opaque donor files Jasmine had highlighted resonated with startling clarity. Soon, the hashtag #SameRulesForAll began trending, migrating beyond politics. In sports, fans used it when questioning why certain athletes received leniency in disciplinary hearings. In entertainment, actors invoked it during disputes over casting and pay equity. Unions held up banners at strikes with the phrase in bold letters. The sentiment spread because it translated easily. Fairness should not be contingent on status. By the second week, corporate boardrooms and nonprofit conferences were debating it as a framing device for transparency in their own sectors. The cultural echo was not uniform, but it was unmistakable. Jasmine had not merely raised a political issue, she had cracked open a question the public was eager to own. The silence that Karoline had left on air became an invitation for millions to speak, question, and reimagine where the line between private branding and public responsibility truly rested. The political consequences arrived with equal intensity. Jasmine's campaign account saw a dramatic spike in small-dollar donations, with thousands of $5 and $10 contributions pouring in daily. Supporters cited not just her bravery but her clarity. She had managed to ask the sharpest question without sounding performative. On the other side, her opponents also experienced a surge, driven by messaging that framed her comments as a vicious attack on the First Family. For weeks, dueling fundraising emails crowded inboxes, both sides claiming the mantle of moral defense. The attention carried darker weight, too. Threat assessments escalated as serious messages targeting Jasmine and her staff arrived in waves. Authorities were notified and protective measures increased. Yet alongside the threats came a flood of thank-you letters. Rena, ever the triage master, created a system where letters of gratitude were carefully cataloged and archived. Jasmine insisted on reading several each night, grounding herself in the voices that reminded her why she had chosen scrutiny over silence. "Storms pass," she often repeated. "Records remain." Meanwhile, oversight committees began moving with quiet determination. Document requests were sent out, some narrowly tailored, others broad enough to unsettle donors. 2 committees began coordinating bipartisan hearing blocks focused on event transparency and donor pathways. It was a slow process, often drowned out by louder theatrics on cable news, but within the corridors of power, it signaled a turning tide. Staffers who had once brushed aside event documentation as procedural clutter now understood its potential to shift political ground. From the public side, advocacy coalesced. The Same Standard Coalition launched, composed of watchdog groups, nonprofit advocates, and a few surprising conservative transparency hawks. Their demand was simple: clearer disclosures on event-based fundraising tied to public branding. The coalition's launch press conference drew more coverage than expected. When asked why now, one organizer answered, "Because one clip made the rules visible. And once people see rules, they want to know if they're being applied equally." The industry responded with a blend of defensiveness and adaptation. A handful of PACs quietly returned checks that raised questions, seeking to avoid the risk of public scrutiny. Compliance officers in multiple firms began circulating new guidelines on brand use for events involving public figures. The language was cautious, avoiding any direct reference to the viral confrontation, but the subtext was clear. The system was recalibrating, even if it was doing so behind closed doors. The political machine, ever hungry for theater, kept spinning. Maddox and Briggs doubled down on their calls for censure, while sympathetic commentators framed Jasmine as reckless. Yet the institutional landscape beneath them had shifted. Once the questions had been asked aloud, no amount of spin could fully erase them. Donor vetting, disclosure practices, and the relationship between family branding and public power would not return to the shadows so easily. By the month's end, Jasmine's clip was still replayed nightly, not as a gaffe or a scandal, but as a watershed. A single moment of stillness on air had detonated into cultural refrains, political recalibrations, and industry shifts. The confrontation that began with silence had produced echoes too loud to ignore. The night was quiet in Tyler, Texas. On the old wooden porch where she had grown up, Jasmine Crockett sat in a single folding chair. The porch light cast a soft halo across the planks, illuminating her face in a way no studio spotlight ever had. Her phone rested propped against the ledge, balanced on a worn book of psalms her grandmother once read from. There were no aides, no staff, no screen. She began slowly, her voice low but steady. "Silence is not neutral," she said. "For the powerful, silence can be a shield. It protects, it delays, it buys time. But for the powerless, silence is a shroud. It hides stories, erases truths, and locks people out of the record. That's why I spoke. That's why I will keep speaking." The air was still, the only sound Jasmine leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "Some people think what I said on live television was personal, that it was meant to wound. But I need you to hear me clearly. It was never about personalities. It was about systems, about how proximity to power can purchase exemptions that ordinary families are never offered. The faces change, the names change, but the structure remains, and that is what we must confront." She paused, letting the truth settle. Her eyes were fixed on the glowing phone screen, but her words seemed aimed beyond it. "They can vote to censure me. They can drag my name through headlines, paint me as reckless, or demand apologies that I will never give. But what they cannot do is vote away reality. Families still carry papers. Communities are still scrutinized. Donors still buy pathways into rooms ordinary people will never see. That truth stands, no matter how they..." Her tone softened as she turned her message outward. "If every family who carries papers like armor, I see you. I know the weight you carry, and I will not let it be invisible. To everyone watching who thinks their story doesn't matter, tell it, write it, post it, whisper it if you must, but do not let the system count on your quiet. And to my colleagues in Congress, stop hiding behind precedent and start passing standards. Standards where no last name, no title, and no family brand can purchase an exception." She sat back, exhaled, and for a moment simply listened to the night sounds. Then she delivered her closing words, calm but unflinching. "Truth doesn't need approval. It needs a spine, and as long as I have breath, I intend to be that spine." Jasmine reached for the phone, her face still illuminated by the porch light. She tapped the screen, ending the stream, and rose from the chair. The camera went black, but the words lingered, traveling into classrooms, courtrooms, sanctuaries, and union halls, carried forward by those who had been waiting to hear their own voices reflected back at them.